You're standing inside a control room just after midnight. The panels glow, the switches click, the numbers keep moving. Outside, the city of Pripyat is asleep. Families are in their apartments. Children's toys are scattered across bedroom floors. Nobody knows that a few miles away, Reactor 4 is being pushed into a state it was never supposed to survive. And the strangest part? This disaster does not begin with an explosion. It begins with a test, a routine test, a scheduled test, a test that was supposed to prove the plant was safe. But over the next 24 hours, one delay, one bad assumption, one hidden flaw, and one button press will line up so perfectly that Chernobyl becomes the most infamous nuclear disaster on Earth. So the question is simple. Was this a human mistake, or was the system already built to fail? On April 25, 1986, Reactor 4 at the Chernobyl nuclear power plant was scheduled for shutdown. That part was normal. The reactor needed maintenance. Operators were preparing to lower power. And during the shutdown, engineers wanted to run an experiment that had already failed before. The goal sounded simple. If the plant lost outside power, coolant pumps still needed electricity. Diesel generators could take over, but they needed time to start. So engineers wanted to know if the spinning turbine could keep the pumps running during that gap. On paper, this was an electrical test, not a nuclear gamble, not a countdown, not the first move in a disaster that would empty an entire city. But Reactor 4 was not an ordinary machine. It was an RBMK-1000. Huge, powerful, Soviet-built, and at low power, it had a dangerous personality. The test required the reactor to be lowered into exactly that risky zone. At first, everything looked routine, but Chernobyl was already waiting for its first mistake. The power reduction began early on April 25th. The crew started bringing Reactor 4 down from full power. The plan was to reach the right level, run the test, then shut everything down. Then the electrical grid needed power. Officials told Chernobyl to pause the shutdown and keep Reactor 4 running longer. That sounds minor, it wasn't. A nuclear reactor does not pause like a stopwatch. Inside the core, physics keeps moving. Chemical conditions shift. Neutron-absorbing xenon begins building up. The reactor changes even while the paperwork stays the same. There was another problem. By the afternoon, parts of the safety setup had already been adjusted for the test. So Reactor 4 was stuck in an awkward state. Not fully normal, not fully shut down, just waiting. Hour after hour, the day shift had prepared for the test. But by the time permission finally came, the original crew was leaving. Now the night shift was walking into a situation they had not created, and the reactor they inherited was already unstable in ways they could not see. Late on April 25th, the power reduction resumed. The night crew had pressure on them from the start. The test had been delayed for hours. The shutdown still needed to happen. The procedure still needed to be completed. And inside Soviet nuclear culture, pushing back against orders was not exactly encouraged. For years, the official story leaned hard on operator error. The crew broke rules. The crew mishandled the reactor. The crew caused the disaster. And yes, mistakes were made. Big ones. But that version is too simple, because these operators were not standing in front of a safe machine randomly making bad choices. They were working with incomplete warnings, unclear procedures, and a reactor design that could become dangerous under the exact conditions of the test. They had a machine with hidden flaws. They had bosses expecting results. They had a test program that treated a nuclear reactor like an electrical generator. And just after midnight, Reactor 4 gave them the first real sign that something was wrong. The power collapsed. Around 12:28 a.m. on April 26th, the reactor's power fell far below the target. The test was supposed to happen at a higher level. Instead, Reactor 4 dropped to roughly 30 megawatts thermal. That was dangerously low. At that level, the reactor became harder to control. Xenon poisoning was building inside the core, absorbing neutrons and choking the reaction. The operators faced a choice: stop the test or bring the reactor back up. They chose to bring it back. To fight the xenon and raise power, they pulled out control rods. That decision matters. Control rods are supposed to slow the nuclear reaction. They are the reactor's main leash. But to revive the reactor, too many rods were withdrawn. Eventually, power climbed back to around 200 megawatts thermal, still far below the intended range. On the surface, the reactor looked alive again, but underneath, the safety margin had been gutted. The machine was standing, but the floor beneath it was cracking. And now, instead of stopping, they moved forward. By around 1 a.m., Reactor 4 was operating in one of the worst possible conditions for an RBMK reactor. Low power, too many control rods removed, coolant flow changing, steam building inside the core. This is where Chernobyl becomes terrifying. The RBMK had something called a positive void coefficient. Simple version, when water coolant turned into steam bubbles, the reaction could increase. More steam could mean more power. More power could mean more heat. More heat could mean more steam, a feedback loop. And the test was about to reduce steam to the turbine, changing coolant conditions even more. Inside the control room, the numbers may not have looked like a disaster yet, but inside the core, the reactor was becoming a loaded spring. Every choice had narrowed the path. The delay, the power drop, the withdrawn rods, the low operating level, each piece stacked higher. And then, at about 1:23 a.m., the test finally began. Steam to the turbine was reduced. The turbine began slowing. The pumps connected to it started changing behavior. Coolant flow shifted, and inside Reactor 4, the balance began to break. Less effective cooling meant more steam bubbles in parts of the core. More steam bubbles meant more reactivity. More reactivity meant more heat. The reactor was not calming down. It was surging. The operators saw the power begin to rise. The machine was slipping away. So someone did what any trained operator would expect to do. They pressed the emergency shutdown button, a Z5. The button meant to stop everything. The button meant to end the danger. But Chernobyl had one final secret. Under those exact conditions, that button did not act like a brake. It acted like the last shove. At 1:23:40 a.m., AZ5 was pressed. The control rods began moving down into the reactor core. In a normal situation, that should have shut the reaction down. But the RBMK control rods had a dangerous design issue. Their tips included graphite displacers. Under certain conditions, when the rods first entered the core, they could briefly increase reactivity before reducing it. That tiny moment was everything. The reactor was already unstable. The power distribution inside the core was already distorted. Too many rods had been withdrawn. Then the shutdown system pushed graphite into the core. The reaction spiked. Power surged violently. Fuel channels ruptured. Steam pressure exploded. Seconds after AZ5 was pressed, Reactor 4 tore itself apart. The first blast ripped through the reactor. A second followed. The roof was blown open. Graphite blocks were thrown into the night. Radioactive material shot into the air. Firefighters arrived thinking they were facing an industrial fire. They did not fully understand what they were standing on. An invisible danger had already escaped. In the first hours after the explosion, confusion took over. Some inside the plant could not accept that the reactor core was gone. The idea was too horrifying, too impossible. A Soviet reactor was not supposed to explode, but it had. Pieces of graphite from the core were scattered across the site. Radiation levels were extreme. Firefighters climbed onto roofs and moved through contaminated areas with little warning. 2 workers died that night or soon after. In the following weeks, dozens of emergency workers and plant staff suffered severe radiation sickness. But the disaster did not stay inside the plant. Pripyat was not immediately evacuated. People woke up on April 26th and continued their day. Children played outside. Residents watched smoke rise from the plant without knowing what it carried. The evacuation did not begin until April 27th. By then, radiation was already moving through the air, and the Soviet system faced a choice: admit the truth or protect the image of control. For a while, it chose control, but radiation does not respect borders. Detectors outside the Soviet Union began picking up evidence that something massive had happened. The secret was leaking into the sky. Chernobyl was not one mistake. It was a stack of failures, a delayed test, a rushed night shift, a reactor operating at dangerously low power. Control rods pulled too far, a hidden design flaw inside the emergency shutdown system, a political culture where bad news moved slowly and obedience moved fast. That is what makes the final 24 hours so disturbing. The disaster was not born in 1 second. It was built, decision by decision, until the button that was supposed to save the reactor helped finish it. So who carries the most blame? The operators who pushed Reactor 4 too far? The engineers who designed a reactor with a dangerous flaw? Or the Soviet system that buried risk under pride, pressure, and silence? Pick a side in the comments.